Noted, though. All right. Excellent. Good morning. Welcome to AEI. We are delighted to have you with us today for what promises to be a hearty, if not heartfelt, discussion about citizenship and the role that a robust civic education plays, not just towards understanding the duties, privileges, and rights of being citizens, but towards maintaining the principles and institutions upon which our liberal democratic republic is built. Today, which I should note, is the 285th birthday of our first president, George Washington. Yay! Cheers to him. We are discussing Making Citizens, a Sputnik moment for civic education. So this past election season, an interesting thing happened. Well, maybe many interesting things happened, and maybe that's not quite the right word for it, but one of those things that happened was that civics educators and those in the civic education community suddenly started to see prominent scholars and writers in other fields and other areas start to write about the importance of civic education and the weakened state, if existence at all, of civic education in our schools and across the nation. There were articles in foreign policy magazines, The Atlantic, New York Times, The Washington Post, and all getting wide viewership. Just this weekend, there was another published in the Wall Street Journal calling for a reintroduction of Western civ classes in colleges. So it's possible that for the first time in a long time, civic education has a chance to come to the forefront of the national discussion, if not the education agenda. But to make something of this opportunity, to paraphrase a certain rapping founding father, we need to make sure that this is a moment, and this is not a moment, but a movement. And we ought not to throw away our shot. To help us understand the moment the civic education is in, we are joined today by several prominent members of that civic education community. So at the far end, we have David Randall, who is the Director of Communications at the National Association of Scholars. Before working at NAS, he was the sole librarian at the John McEnroe Library at New York Studio School. A professional historian by training, he has additional degrees in fiction writing and library science. He writes often about education and civics and is the lead author of the new report, Making Citizens, How American Universities Teach Civics. Next to him is Robert Pondicio, is Senior Fellow and Vice President for External Affairs at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. He's also a Senior Advisor to Democracy Prep Public Schools, a network of high-performing charter schools based in Harlem, New York. He writes and speaks extensively on education and education reform issues with an emphasis on literacy, curriculum, teaching, and urban education. After 20 years in journalism, including senior positions at Time and Business Week, Mr. Pondicio became a fifth grade teacher at a struggling South Bronx public school. He subsequently served as vice president for the Core Knowledge Foundation. Next to him, not quite next to him, but Mr. Juan Rangel is president of Mastery Consulting. He has served as CEO of the United Neighborhood Organization, Metropolitan Chicago's largest Hispanic community-based organization. During his tenure, he greatly increased the scope and impact. In 2001, he co-developed the Metropolitan Leadership Institute, which is aimed at engaging young Hispanic professionals in the public arena, including political, corporate, governmental, and nonprofit spheres. Among his accomplishments as CEO, he opened the Octavio Paz Charter School in 1998. Since then, UNO has expanded its network to include 12 K-8 elementary schools, 2 high schools, and 1 K-12 school. And then we have Charles Somm, who is Director of Education Policy at the Manhattan Institute. Previously, he helped lead the Manhattan Institute's development team. Before joining, Mr. Somm worked for a number of elected officials and education nonprofits. His writings on education, policing, and other public policy issues have appeared in numerous newspapers. And finally, I'm Rebecca Burgess. Thank you for joining us today. I manage the program on American citizenship here at AEI. So how this panel is going to go is David will lead us off. We'll have about 10 minutes of discussion from each of the panelists, followed by questions, followed then by opening up the discussion with the room. Want to take us away?
All right. So January 29th, JFK Airport, a crowd of 500 people came together carrying signs to protest President Trump's executive order on illegal immigration. Signs said, F Trump, F. Pence, America's Built on Immigrants. De Anza Community College, Bay Area of California. The college organizes students for a variety of political campaigns. One is to secure federal money for illegal immigrants. Another is to raise San Jose's subsidy of public transit. A third is to get the state taxes raised by getting rid of exemptions in Proposition 13. Back in November, high school students around the nation from Maryland to Oregon walk out of classes, again, protesting President Trump. University of Denver. Undergraduate students working at something called public achievement coaches go into the high schools and they teach the students about America being built on oppression and privilege. University of Texas at Austin a few weeks ago, huge rally, again, protest against President Trump. The Women's March of Austin and the One Resistance come together. Pomona College, last November, November 9th. Pomona College pays to bus students to an anti-Trump rally in downtown Los Angeles. They even pay to reimburse the students who miss the bus. And just last week in Manhattan, students walk out of class for a mass demonstration in Foley Square. One of them has a sign, "Make racists afraid again." So what do all these have in common? The person who organized the rally at the airport was a man named Daniel Altshuler, who's the director of civic engagement for a nonprofit called Make the Road New York. At De Anza Community College, it's their Center for Civic Engagement that directly organizes the students for these political campaigns. Civic engagement professionals praised the high school students who walked out nationwide as engaging in an excellent form of civic engagement. The public achievement coaches say they're teaching civics when they teach about privilege and oppression. At the University of Texas at Austin, the anti-Trump rally is heralded as a banner weekend of civic engagement. Pomona College's Civic Engagement Center is the one that pays to send students on an anti-Trump rally. And just this last week, the high school teachers in Manhattan refer to the students walking out of class as being part of a surge of civic engagement. You're hearing an awful lot about civic engagement all around the country, and it seems to be being used as a synonym for organized political protest, virtually all on one side of the political spectrum. How did we at the National Association of Scholars first hear about this? Because 5 years ago, the Obama administration's Department of Education came out with a report, Advancing Civic Learning, which endorsed civic engagement and other allied activities and started putting the weight of the Department of Education towards spreading civic engagement even further throughout the nation's colleges and universities. And when we read this, we were curious because when they talked about civic engagement, it didn't seem to be the traditional civics curriculum. So we went to look more deeply into what this civic engagement was. So here's what we found out. A great deal of it is indeed vocational training for how to be a political organizer. At the University of Colorado at Boulder, their civic engagement program teaches you, campaign work, volunteer recruitment, social media, fundraising, grant proposal writing, grassroots organizing, and lobbying. At Northwestern University, it's a similar assortment. They associate it more with a capstone project, needs-based assessments, and asset planning. At the University of Maryland in Baltimore, again, a similar complex. They talk about training you for the business practices needed for running this sort of community organization. So it's basically this sort of vocational training, but it's bundled with a number of political beliefs. University of Colorado at Boulder says civic engagement ought to be associated with social justice and environmental justice. Here at the District of Columbia, Georgetown University's Civic Engagement Center also associates civic engagement with social justice, the same for American University, social justice and civic engagement. What's meant by social justice? Carolina Center for Public Service, I think it is called, they have a handbook on how this sort of new civic stuff should be teaching social justice in the classroom. Is available nationwide. Their definition of social justice is learning about the oppressions and the privileges that make up America, and the fabric of oppression adheres to whites, heterosexuals, middle class and wealthy people, temporarily able people, people from Western European culture. If you're civically engaged and it's bound up with social justice, you're supposed to be affirming that statement of oppression and privileges. It's because you have this sort of bundling that at Colorado State University, they have a Feed the Hungry project. You collect cans, but it's not just about collecting cans for the hungry. You're, excuse me, you're also supposed to affirm that hunger is the result of systemic poverty. And that means that poverty is the result of a system of the free market economy, which causes poverty, which causes hunger. If you want to get rid of hunger, you've got to get rid of the system of the free market economy. So you're supposed, as part of collecting cans, to start affirming there is this systemic poverty. You're supposed to commit yourself to activism to get rid of oppression. This bundling in Georgetown means you take a civic engagement course on theater as social activism, which is how you put your social justice principles to work via learning about performance art. And this sort of bundling is why you have the career tracks which result from a major, a specialization in civic engagement. A decade ago, a young lady named Dulce Sáenz was a public achievement coach at the University of Denver. Now, this last year, she worked as the coordinator for the Colorado and Washington state campaigns for the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign. That seems to be the standard sort of career track that's intended. At the same time, you have reports from organizations like the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. And these reports reveal that a majority of college graduates don't know that senators serve 6-year terms. And a majority of college graduates don't know what the Emancipation Proclamation did, and a majority of college graduates don't know who was the victorious general at Yorktown. There is a connection between college students being educated for civic engagement, but not being educated for civic literacy. And there's a great deal more in our Making Citizens report, but I just want to leave it at civic engagement is part of a movement which we believe is contributing to the crisis in civics education in America, and it's why we do now very much need a Sputnik moment. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Robert Pondicio. Good morning. As some of you might know, Charles Somm and I are devotees of E.D. Hirsch Jr. of core knowledge fame. Hirsch came to public prominence back in 1987 with a book that you may have read called Cultural Literacy. Maybe you didn't read it, but you probably own it. It became a bestseller on the strength of a list of 5,000 places and dates and names that every American should know, according to Hirsch. When I invoke Hirsch's work, it's usually about reading comprehension, which is an area that I guess would be my specialty. So Hirsch was making a technical point about reading comprehension, but he was not trying to impose a conservative, dead white male orthodoxy on American education, which is what he was accused of incorrectly at the time. Now, recently, Eric Liu of the Aspen Institute, who is very much a man of the left, as is Don Hirsch, not incidentally, has tried to inspire a revival of Hirsch's list. Liu argues, and I strongly agree, that the United States needs that common knowledge more than ever. And I've got Eric's quote here. He said that we need a 21st century sense of cultural literacy that has to be radically more diverse and inclusive. So Eric has invited any number of prominent Americans, perhaps some of you, to create their own top 10 lists of what Americans need to know and post them on a website that he's created. I've got a few of those lists here. So these are some people whose names you might know. Take a quick look at these lists. And let me just add, there's nothing on these lists that I disagree with. As a teacher, I want my students to know these things. Let me also quickly concede that it's a bit of a fool's errand to come up with a list of 10 and only 10 things that every American should know. But notice the orientation. Ask smart people what an education that is radically diverse and inclusive looks like, and they will, no surprise, try to come up with a list of people, events, and ideas that includes those that we have historically marginalized in this country. Let me show you the list that I submitted to Eric's website. Now you can look at this and you may say, but wait, this isn't diverse. You ignored the task. This does nothing to further the cause of inclusion and diversity. I don't agree. So let me defend my choices. There was a fascinating article last year, which you may have seen in the American Interest, which I highly recommend to you. It was written by a man named John Haidt of New York University. It was about the clash between what he described as nationalists and globalists that has given us the Brexit vote, the rise of Donald Trump, as well as the sense that John wrote that something, quote, dangerous and ugly is spreading. Haidt's big idea is that globalization and rising prosperity have changed the values and behavior of urban elites. And this is a quote, leading them to talk and act in ways that unwittingly activate authoritarian tendencies in the subset of the nationalists. Now remember this phrase, it's important, that we are, quote, unwittingly activating authoritarian tendencies. Those who dismiss those tendencies as mere racism, Haidt noted, again quoting, have missed several important aspects of moral psychology related to the general human need to live in a stable and coherent moral order. I think I've got another quote from John here. No, sorry. But let me just quote him at length here. John Haidt wrote that nationalists see patriotism as a virtue. They think their country and its culture are unique and worth preserving. This is a real moral commitment, not opposed to cover up racist bigotry. Nationalists feel a bond with their country, and they believe that this bond imposes moral obligation both ways. Citizens have a duty to love and serve their country, and governments are duty-bound to protect their own people. Governments should place their citizens' interests above the interests of people in other countries. There is nothing necessarily racist or base about this arrangement or social contract, Haidt wrote. Having a shared sense of identity, norms, and history generally promotes trust. Now, I don't have time this morning to go deeply into Haidt's argument, but it draws deeply on the work of a woman named Karen Stenner, who is an Australian political scientist who studies authoritarianism, racism, and intolerance. The core finding of Stenner's work is this, that authoritarianism is not a stable personality trait, but rather a psychological predisposition to become intolerant when the person perceives a certain kind of threat. In short, we are basically a tolerant people, all of us. But most of us have what John Haidt described as an authoritarian button on our forehead that, when pushed, focuses us on defending our in-group. So now, look, Stenner is a political scientist. Haidt is a psychologist. Neither one is involved in K-12 education. But these insights, I think, are absolutely critical for K-12 education, particularly for those of us who are concerned with civic education and the citizen-making role of schools. So common sense would suggest that exposure to difference, discussion and celebration of diversity would be critical to understanding, to empathy. But what if this humane impulse is exactly the wrong one? All the available evidence, and here I'm quoting Karen Stenner, all the available evidence indicates that exposure to difference, talking about difference, applauding difference, the hallmarks of a liberal democracy are the surest way to aggravate those who are innately intolerant, she wrote, and to guarantee increased expression of their predispositions in manifestly intolerant attitudes and behaviors. Paradoxically, she writes, it would seem that we can best limit intolerance by parading, we can limit intolerance by parading, talking about, and applauding our sameness. Now, this is fascinating. If you are my age, you remember that a linchpin of your K-12 education was the image and narrative of the country as a melting pot. If you are under the age of 30 or 40, this probably was not part of your K-12 education. Bring me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Now, gradually, the melting pot metaphor fell into disrepute for very good reasons, let's be clear. But I do wonder if abandoning that melting pot imagery, even as an ideal, might be precisely the kind of normative threat that Haidt and Stenner were writing about. I did a little back-of-the-envelope analysis that may fascinate you. I hope it does. It fascinated me. I looked at the mission statements of the 100 largest school districts in America, which collectively educate 11 million of our children. Here's a word cloud of the most common words in those mission statements. The personal and private reasons for education, preparation for college and career, for example, are much more on the minds of the men and women who crafted these mission and vision statements for our largest school districts. The words college and career easily outnumber civic and citizen. The fourth most used word was community, which is interesting. However, that term occurs most frequently in phrases like community of learners, or referring to what the community can do for the student rather than what the student is expected to do for the community. Now look, that's not a bad goal, obviously. It's just simply not the same as preparing students for active citizenship. Now, some terms are conspicuous in their absence. The words patriotic and patriotism do not appear at all in any of the 100 largest mission statements. Only 2 districts, Wichita Public Schools and Utah's Alpine School District, include the word democracy. Maryland's Anne Arundel County is the only district that specifically mentions U.S. citizenship in its mission or vision statements. Now, this is perhaps the most surprising of all. The words America and American appear in none of the 100 mission statements of our 100 largest school districts. However, global appears in the statements of 28, usually in phrases like global society, global economy, or global citizens. Now, remember what Stenner said. Nothing inspires greater tolerance than an abundance of common and unifying beliefs, practices, rituals, and institutions. But when smart men and women, publicly spirited men and women, sit down to consider the goals of our public education school systems, they mostly talk about the private and personal, not the shared and the common. 28 mentions of global, 0 of American. I will avoid the temptation, in conclusion, to call this alarming. I will merely say it's interesting. But it raises in my mind the question of whether it's time to reinvest our children in a shared American narrative, a complicated, to be sure, and at times uncomfortable narrative, but one in which we all fully share.
Good morning. My name is Juan Rangel. I'm the president of Mastery Consulting, and I'm currently working on an interesting project considering our times of empowering the Mexican and Mexican-American community. And one thing I think our president has done for this particular community is made us realize that we really don't have the power that we ought to have in this country. And so hopefully our aim is to change that. Prior to that, let me say that I started my career, my public career, as a community organizer on the south side of Chicago. So that'll perk you up a bit. 20 years ago, I founded our first charter school and grew that into one of the largest networks of charter schools in the country, with 16 schools, mostly Hispanic students, about 98% Hispanic, 93% below or at poverty rate, and a higher percentage of English language learners. Very successful school network. In 2006, you may recall, there were a number of large, what they were calling mega marches across the country, aimed at trying to spur immigration reform. In 2006 in particular, Chicago had its first and very, very large march and rally in downtown. And I remember one of our teachers asked me if he can take our students down to the march. And my response was absolutely not. Partly because I don't believe that's the role of a school to be doing that. And second, I think in terms of using my community organizer hat, I consider that lazy organizing, of just taking your kids out for a protest. And I would say the same thing with our current school reform movement. When we do marches and rallies, that the tendency is to take kids out and show that kids are part of the movement, when in reality we ought to be organizing the adults, not the kids. And that's just a fundamental belief that I have. But there is a role for civic engagement in the schools. Last week, across the country, there are numerous cities that had the Day Without Immigrants. I'm not sure how successful that was, but Chicago Public Schools reported that 15% of their students, or around 50,000 students, didn't show up at school. And I just disagree with that kind of an action. I think it's important for our kids to learn about our times and the challenges before us, but it's more of it's a teaching moment, not necessarily an activist moment for our kids. Sometimes I think it's more to indulge the adults than it is to teach our children. A very key component of what we're trying to do, what we continue to do within our schools, is to make active citizens out of our students and informed citizens at that. Ours is a community of primarily immigrant families. And I think like any child who grows up, any child, regardless of their background, kids grow up with identity issues. We all did, right? And I think if you pile on top of that the whole immigrant status, whether it's legal or illegal, it makes it a little bit harder. And I think that the responsibility of the school is to help kids get through that process as well. And certainly in making them feel that they are part of the whole. And I think a school's responsibility is that, to make Americans. And why not do that specifically with an immigrant community, where they have a stake not only in their success, but in the stake of their community and the stake in the success of this country. I don't think that we're doing that anymore. And certainly the times kind of give us the easy out of saying that we're going to create activists out of our kids. I'm not sure that that's the role of the school. One of the things that we would do with our students is take them to where Chicago would do our 8th grade field trip to DC, our nation's capital, so they can see the monuments, they can see where the seat of government is, and meet with their elected representatives. Our 7th graders would do a trip to New York. New York is New York. It's not Chicago, but it's New York. And part of our trip was taking them to see the Statue of Liberty. Right? These are images that our kids are familiar with, but there's nothing like seeing it up front. But even more important than the Statue of Liberty is taking them to Ellis Island and getting them to learn and read and study the stories of other immigrants in the past, and let them realize that the challenges that they might have personally at home in their communities in this country as an immigrant class is not new. It's part of the American story. And we've seen this story in the past, whether it's the Irish, the Italians, the Polish, now it's the Mexicans. And we have a story to tell, but more importantly, we have a story to write. And I think that's what we were trying to do with our schools, and why that's the kind of civic engagement that we were trying to accomplish. Even though we wore our community organizing hat, it was understanding that in order to build power in this country, you have to be invested in this country as well. I would say that a lot of our kids, you fast forward today, I bump into those kids. They're now graduates from universities, and they're doing quite well. Very proud of that. But I think they feel that they have a role in this country. This morning, I woke up, and on my Facebook feed, what comes up is one of those memories from a few years ago. This was 6 years ago. I see on my phone. 6 years ago, I had posted a picture of our kids coming out to vote. It was election day. And what we would do on election day, our schools would be closed, and we would use that day for professional development. So our teachers would come to the school would be out for the kids. But on that same day, we would have mock elections, and we would encourage our kids to come out and vote. We wouldn't give them any incentive, no rewards, no prizes, no pizza parties for the class that has more voters. It's purely your will and your civic duty to come out. And every year I would be amazed as to how many kids would actually just come out and vote, cast their ballot. The rule at the school was teachers cannot influence the kids at who to vote for them. 6 years ago, on that picture, that's when Rahm Emanuel was running for mayor for the first time. And many people may know that I was a big supporter of Rahm during that campaign. But even I was not going to influence how our kids voted. And it was an interesting election. But what I remember back then is that our junior class from our high school had 100% of our students come out to vote. And so think about it. These are juniors. These are kids that they're their cool stage of their lives, but they're coming to the school on their day off to come and vote. And there's no prize for it, no incentive, only the pride of knowing that they did their civic duty. And I think that's missing in our schools today. We do teach our kids too often, or our society too often, about kind of the challenges that this country has undergone over its 200 plus years. And it's not a perfect system, right? But I think it's still the best country as to why people come to it. In spite of the hardships that immigrants have had in the past, in spite of the hardships that Mexicans may have today, I can guarantee you there'll be more coming, because people look to, and they understand, I think more than anybody, they understand that this country doesn't guarantee anything other than an opportunity. And I think that's the story that we try to get across to our students. And civic engagement means something very different to us than what it might mean within the activist circles. Even today, I don't think it's the role of the teachers to baby our students into a false sense of security. I think it's better to have an open debate and dialogue as to why things are happening as they are. Why is there a debate around immigration? Why are there people that are saying things about a certain community and all that? That's part of our history. And I think we'll all be better off for having that debate.
Okay, thanks. Let me just say that Juan's schools are excellent, and he does incredible work in the Latino community in Chicago. And we actually gave the Manhattan Institute, where I work, gave him our Social Entrepreneurship Award many years ago. And the the charter network has only expanded since then. So thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for AEI for having this discussion and the work you do on the program on American citizenship. You mentioned it's George Washington's birthday today, and usually on his birthday in the Senate, they read his farewell address. The Senate's in recess, but on Monday, Senator Ben Sasse is going to, first order of business, read the farewell address on the Senate floor. It's a tradition that began in 1862 as a morale-boosting gesture during the darkest days of the Civil War. And I understand that not a lot of senators hang around to listen to the farewell address being read on the Senate floor, but it's a shame because the concerns that Washington voiced in his farewell remain starkly, almost eerily relevant to our political moment that we're experiencing right now. He talks about, as you all know, hyperpartisanship, foreign influence, excessive debt. And John Avlon, the editor-in-chief of the Daily Beast, a brilliant guy and a beautiful writer, he has a new book out actually on the farewell address, and which I highly recommend. It's an interesting book, talks about how the farewell address used to be, more widely known than the Declaration. It used to be used in civics classes. Kids used a mnemonic device to remember what Washington's warnings were, and it's kind of gone out of fashion. Most people don't even know about it anymore. But in what may be the most interesting chapter in a fascinating book, he talks about Washington's ideas about education. He was obsessed with public education, the subject we're here to talk about today, civic education. And although he was the founder with the least amount of formal education, Washington emerged as a leading proponent of public education after the Revolution. He talked about education the same way that Lincoln talked about education, another president with little formal education. How Lincoln talked about education a few decades later as essential to national unity and the success of our experiment in self-government. In the book, Avalon recounts how Washington was fixated on the notion that we should improve public education and have a national university here in the nation's capital. And they actually set aside some space. It's now the Naval Observatory, but he could never persuade Congress to fund the national university, which they considered, probably rightly, outside the bounds of the new Constitution. But it's really funny. Washington kept wanting to put a section in his farewell address about education and about the national university, and Alexander Hamilton, who helped him craft the final version, kept cutting it out. And finally, Washington literally cut and pasted the following two sentences in the final version. He wrote, "Promote then as an object of primary importance institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge. In proportion as the structure of a government gives force to public opinion, it is essential that public opinion should be enlightened." I think we all realize that public opinion is not very enlightened these days. We could go on and cite all the dreary statistics. A 2010 Pew Research poll showed that a large percentage of Americans don't know how the legislative process works. 44% couldn't even name a single branch of the three branches of government. A 2008 survey found that 57% of the nation's 17-year-olds were unable to place a civil war within the correct 50-year time period. Former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor has dubbed Americans' lack of history and civics knowledge as a quiet crisis, and she's right. And so how do we fix this problem? Obviously, the answer is a hip-hop Broadway musical about the nation's first Treasury Secretary. It springs right to mind, right?
Genius.
So I'm a huge Hamilton fan. Robert knows this. Actually, I saw Hamilton for the first time 2 years ago on Super Bowl Sunday at the Public Theater. And at intermission, I texted Robert and our friend Seth Andrew, founder of Democracy Prep, and saying, "Oh my God, I have goosebumps. We have to get every kid in New York City to see this show." And they're doing that. The Gilder Lehrman Institute is a great organization. Probably many of you are familiar with it. They, through the Rockefeller Foundation and others, they're bringing tens of thousands of kids to see Hamilton in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. In fact, today, 1,900 students in Chicago are going to see Hamilton, including students from 2 UNO charter schools. And through this program, the kids not only see the show, they participate in a 6 to 8 week Hamilton curriculum. Students are given this beautiful study guide, which provides a great deal of background information about Hamilton and the characters in the show and the information on the founding era. Teachers are given a teacher's guide. Students are taught about primary sources They used Samuel Seabury's Westchester Farmer pamphlet and Alexander Hamilton's pamphlet, The Farmer Refuted, to argue the pros and cons of staying with Great Britain or declaring independence. They analyzed the lyrics from the song in the show, The Farmer Refuted, and discussed the historical accuracy and integrity, and how to take history and make it into a work of art. And then the students create their own original work of art based on their classroom studies: song, rap, poetry, monologues. Each school selects their best, votes for their best performance, and then those students perform on the stage of the theater. And it's great. And if you can Google this, you can just look at Hamilton performances, student performances. I mean, it's amazing to watch these kids, singing about the Boston Massacre or the Federalist Papers, or a lot of times what they do is they often decide to tell the story of some figures in American history whose stories haven't received enough attention. Phyllis Wheatley or Abigail Adams or Sally Hemings, it's just what Hamilton has done is just so beautiful. The fact that it's told via hip hop by a multiracial cast has led underprivileged minority kids to come away from the show with a changed view of America and themselves. Many will tell you that for the first time they see themselves as Americans. But the phenomenon of Hamilton, I think, makes a larger point. American history, when it's told in a way that resonates, is fascinating. And not just for kids. There are no fewer than 4 podcasts devoted to the musical right now, and I listen to all of them. So many times you'll hear adults say, "Why didn't I learn this in high school? Why wasn't I taught this in high school?" And they probably were, but it just didn't resonate in a way that was meaningful to them. I've never seen a phenomenon like it. The Chernow book that's based on it was published in 2004. It went to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list last year, and it's still right now at #8 on the New York Times bestseller list. So it shows you that the market demand is there. We just have to be better and more creative about meeting it. The #1, I'm kind of very practical and I agree with what the other panelists have said, that civic action separate from civic literacy is kind of hollow. So there are steps. I think I focus on K-12, so just let me give you a couple ideas of what we can do to help improve history and civics education in the K-12. One is just support the Gilder Lehrman Institute. They are doing such great work, even much more than they were doing even 3 years ago. They're getting involved in not only in the Hamilton initiative, but in pedagogy. They've put together this really great kind of K-12 curriculum called Teaching Literacy Through History. It's kind of morphed into a real curriculum now. Their website's getting 7 million unique visitors a year. They have a great AP history guide. They have 2 high schools they operate in New York City. They now have an online master's program for teachers, which they have some of the preeminent historians in America offer these courses online. It's very inexpensive. 800 teachers are now participating in that. They have a History Teacher of the Year award, essay competitions, and Jim Basker, the president, has said that Hamilton has really influenced what they're doing. They're giving a lot more thought into how to take what's the excitement and joy of Hamilton and use that and broaden it. And then the other thing I would just say is it's always a good idea to emulate Massachusetts in education. Massachusetts actually has the Fordham Institute did a study of all the state's history standards back in 2011. It's a lot of date. They should update it. I don't know if there are plans to do that.
I'm on it, sir.
Okay, oh good. But Massachusetts, and other states, South Carolina, actually, California, they were rated A's. And Massachusetts, they and other states that were rated A, they teach history. In New York, we teach it just in 1 year. And it's really not enough time. By the time, you can get through the founding era, it's Halloween, it's only a few weeks, you really can't go deep on these subjects. The states that really seem to do well on history and civics, they have a well thought out sequential curriculum. Usually kids get history, embedded in social studies in elementary, middle school is 2 years of American history. And then also in high school, you repeat it and go deeper for another 2 years. And that's what Massachusetts does and other states do. Massachusetts also has a very serious credentialing program for history teachers. You have to have a history major or pass a very serious licensure exam to become a history teacher. And then one final thing that I know that I'll mention that I know Robert is a big fan of, kind of on the other end of the scale, a bare minimum, a low bar, is there's an organization called the Joe Foss Institute that is it's one of the most successful state referendum initiatives that's taking place. They have 14 states now signed up to make it a criteria of high school graduation that every student take and pass the citizenship exam that all immigrants have to take and pass. And it's a pretty low bar, and but it should be one that everyone in this country should be able to meet. It just asks you basic questions about our government, and how many branches of government there are, and how many, what a Senate term is, how many years. 14 states have done this so far. It's an idea that's getting traction. Perhaps teachers could do it on Constitution Day, September 17th. Just have the kids take the exam, talk about the answers, and a very simple thing you could do to kind of just at least get kids over that very minimum bar. But those are some practical ideas.
All right, thank you. So do any of you have thoughts or questions or pokes at each other before I raise a few questions?
I just want to respond real quickly to what Charles was just saying about the Joe Foss Institute thing, because there are serious people in civics who think, and the air quotes are intentional, who think this is the worst idea ever. That this demeans civic education, that it takes time away from more serious pursuits, and I tend to be the guy who says, what other serious pursuits? My only quibble with the idea that you should, and by the way, if you haven't taken the citizenship test, do it. You can do it online this afternoon. There's 100 questions. If you're new to this country, you get 10. If you get 6 right, you pass it. What is the data, Charles? Like 98% of would-be immigrants successfully pass this. For our own children, it's somewhere, depending on who's doing the data, between 1/2 and 2/3, which is an embarrassment. So my only disagreement is this should not be a high school graduation requirement. It should be an elementary school graduation requirement. The core knowledge sequence, of which we're both fond of E.D. Hirsch's work, all of the questions come up by 4th grade in core knowledge. So, please, let's not have this conversation about how, this is taking time away from more important things. As a practical matter, if you get to the end of your K-12 education and you can't do this, something has gone very, very wrong. Let's not lie to ourselves about that.
And if I could just also speak up. Lucian Spartaro, who's one of the people working for this, he has this wonderful question. What's the most common question you get from students? Is it going to be on the test? And as he says, if you put it on the test, it does give a real motivation for students, just practically speaking. So I think he's absolutely right to focus on the fact that it's a very practical method to improve civics knowledge.
And you can study for it in an afternoon. This is not a heavy lift. Literally, in 2 hours, you can study and pass this test. It's not too much to ask.
David, I had a question about some of the points that you raised that I'm wondering if the panelists would engage with. And one of that is there's a real concern, I would say, within the civic community and population at large about the lack of engagement of young people in our voting process or in our institutions. So how do we, in your telling, the civic engagement that is fostered or pushed at the university level is more on the negative spectrum. So how do we distance out or separate out the type of negative activism that is partisanship that you speak of versus actually fostering a civic engagement that is healthy?
We have been arguing that the people who are constructing this pedagogy are the activists you're talking about. And therefore, it's very difficult to reform it. So we have been arguing that in point of fact, you do need to replace the entire vocabulary associated with this, civic engagement, service learning, global civics, because it was built to be open for this activism. Now, there's a one true Scotsman argument, which is obvious. One can, that's not really what it is. Civic engagement is really supposed to be the apolitical stuff. I do think it was built to be politicized. I guess I would say the most important thing, if you're going to argue for reform rather than root and branch change, is to explicitly acknowledge that it has been politicized and to work very hard and diligently to make sure that civic engagement and all its service learning allies aren't politicized and that there are guardrails up, institutional guardrails, to keep it from being politicized. But that does need, I think, to have an explicit awareness that it has gone wrong in many, many instances, many true Scotsmen, we would say, and that if you are going to reform, you need to be able to, if you're going to make a concerted argument for reform, I think you need to have a concerted effort to remove the politicization from the way it is currently.
I'm not teaching this year, but I teach a senior seminar in civics and citizenship at Democracy Prep, which is charter high school in New York City. Oddly enough, we do a lot of this stuff. These are graduation requirements, all the things that you were talking about in terms of phone banking, civic engagement, lobbying, et cetera. You have to do these things in order to graduate from Democracy Prep, and our students do a capstone Change the World project in which they choose an issue that matters to them, and then they do a year-long examination, a lit review, and apply all these civic skills to their project. I guess my test for bias would be like Justice Black's definition of pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. So as their teacher for these projects, I'm fine with their applying their political views to their projects, but the key thing is they're choosing. I'm not steering it, I'm not choosing it for them. So I'm mentoring a girl this year who is, her project is on microaggressions, which if Stephanie's laughing, because she knows me and she knows my position on this, so the gods are punishing me, but it's her project, and I'm making sure she's rich and rigorous in her work, but I'm not steering her away from, to adopt my point of view on that. So I think that's perfectly valid. I think there's room to do both. It's tricky and it requires a great deal of nuance and expertise on the part of the teacher. I wouldn't want to put a bright shining line around it and say, no, you can't do that kind of civic engagement work. But you got to be really, really careful not to apply your own biases to it.
Charles Owen, did you have any thoughts?
Well, I was just going to add that I think that that's the key. Can the teacher remove themselves and let the student experience this process? And in a democracy, it becomes a give and take, and that's part of the learning for a student. But if the teacher sees themselves, and we were having a conversation earlier about the media, sometimes the media see themselves as the activists also, and that's not their role. Their role is to report. Unless you're a commentator, that's a different thing. Same thing with the teacher. You're there to teach, and if you're going to teach the various points of view, and you can say, this is my point of view, but it doesn't have to be your point of view, but let the student experience the democratic process. When it comes to legislation, it becomes a give and take. And I think we're seeing it play out right now with our president, the Republican Congress, and the minority Democratic Party. It's playing itself out in the courts, in Congress, and through our president. And that's something that is a teachable moment for our kids. It's not to say that we can't have opinions, but it's an opportunity for them to learn about that process as well.
This raises something that I've been wondering about in lieu of your presentations, which Robert mentioned, the question about patriotism and nationalism, and the common set of facts. How do we agree? How do we come to a type of agreement about the type of common facts we're going to teach when we can't even agree about what are facts? Or someone argued that that's the situation today. There are two separate narratives going on with two separate facts basis. So if patriotism is the guard against nationalism, which some would argue, then how do we foster patriotism when we have no common set of things to talk about?
Can I give you a complete and total cop-out answer? But I think it's a valid one. I invoked Don Hirsch, E.D. Hirsch's work before, and if you don't know it, he's the founder of the Core Knowledge Foundation, which sets out a K through 8, basically a scope and sequence of what students should know. Here is my best guess. If you were to put teachers and parents from all 50 states in 50 different rooms, guided by Hirsch's logic, which is got all the cognitive science in the world behind it, that look, reading comprehension is not 26 letters in the words you form. It's context. It's shared knowledge that gives language. It's your ability to comprehend it. If you asked 50 groups of people in 50 different states, okay, what should kids know in science, art, music, history, et cetera, in K 1, 2, 3, all the way through grade 8, I would bet you real money that you'd get something like 95 to 98% overlap. There would not be a lot of controversy because you're not going to teach, the controversial stuff until high school, frankly. And then if we had that common knowledge base, K through 5 and ideally K through 8, then it would enliven and enrich those other conversations. I've sometimes said that here's my idea of a great civic education. On the first day of school, you read the preamble to the Constitution and you discuss what it means to build a more perfect union. And then for the next 13 years, you discuss where we have met that goal, where we have fallen short of that goal, and where we have exceeded that goal. Not a bad education, but critically, it has to be informed by not by emotion and grievance, but by knowledge and a shared commitment to that idea.
I would just say that I think that a lot of the instability you see in our politics right now is based on a lack of knowledge. If you know about the branches of government and our history and the Constitution, you know that we've been having these debates since Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. And so that you can raise the discussion to a different place, and you don't just devolve into calling people Hitler or Stalin, And so I think that it's kind of inseparable. The knowledge goes along with the substance and the civility and the citizenship that we're looking for.
Mm-hmm. One of the elements of the civic education puzzle, if you will, is the teachers involved, right? So how do we help the teachers who are the ones who are at the forefront of this debate? They feel all the heat from the parents, the community, for either being too political or not political enough, but then it turns out, so our own program, the Program on American Citizenship, has done a few studies of teachers, and one, we found that civics teachers are probably the most civic-minded, hearts of gold, really, almost, teachers, because they, unlike teachers in the STEM areas, almost have to use their own vacation time to engage in any type of professional development. So they don't even have time, let alone to teach very much in the classroom, but they don't even have time to work on their own knowledge base. So how do we, at what point or what level of national government or not do we need to be taking that element into it, without which kind of all that we have talked about are nice and for the birds.
You know the joke, right, among civics teachers, that every civics teacher in America has a different last name, but they all have the same first name, which is Coach. Because it's become a bit of a backwater. We don't valorize it enough. One of the problems, and I think we're seeing this now, is you can't teach what you don't have. If you got a poor education in history and civics yourself, you're just not. I mean, there's a crisis of competence. That's indelicate. I wouldn't say that. There is a lack of capacity, shall we say, across K-12 in all subjects. This is just okay. Here we are talking about civics, but to my point about mission statements, who else is having this conversation? So it is Gordian knot that you have to unwind. You have to make it a priority. You have to raise a generation of students to whom it's important, who see it as a value to impart to the next generation. You have to build capacity. You have to put assessments in place to make it. It doesn't get taught. It doesn't get tested. It doesn't get taught, etc. So there's not one. You can't pick and choose. You kind of have to make this a priority. Citizenship should be the third C with college and career.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ted.
I guess.
If I may, just building on what you were saying, one of you was saying earlier, and I beg your pardon. Teaching licensure. If you have the license requirements build up for a deeper knowledge of American history, for example, you're going to build up a greater core of people who are equipped to teach civics. Combine that with, I think, civil society, by which I mean if there are any friendly billionaires in the audience, There are programs
See,
such as Teaching American History, I think it's called, which does, it's private support for teacher development for students for teachers high school teachers to learn how to teach American history properly. They get courses on the American Revolution, the constitutional founding. We need another set of such programs, again, friendly billionaire, who will support this with the more civic focus. Ideally, you need, therefore, this, and whatever the state government can do to encourage, governments can do to encourage this sort of thing, but some mixture of state action such as licensure and civil society, people coming together to support this sort of education at the level we're interested in, higher education and K-12.
See, I guess I would see it differently in the sense of civics is not a program. It's not part of a school. It ought to be the school. And it's what's the purpose of the public school system in this country? And do we as a nation have a will to ensure that we are educating great citizens of our country? And I think that's what we were trying to do, make informed citizens out of our students. So civics wasn't a program, and it wasn't, can we find the right civics teacher? That's everybody's job.
If I can just jump in too, those of us who think of ourselves as ed reformers, we kind of own this a little bit. We have narrowed our view of what a good education is to math and reading and not a lot else. There's a whole public dimension of education that folks like Jefferson and Benjamin Rush and Lincoln and others would have talked about. They would not recognize the conversation that we're having about education. I like to joke that Horace Mann probably went to his grave never having once uttered the phrase college and career ready. Was not what he was thinking about. There is a vital citizen-making role that these institutions were intended to play, and as my mission statement experiment showed, not only have we abandoned it, we've just completely forgotten that it even exists.
I think in this Fordham report from a few years ago, they say that elementary and middle school students spend 7% of their time in social studies classes, which is not very much.
Not very much at all.
I'm surprised it's that high, honestly.
We have time for a few questions. If you can wait for the microphone and state your name and then put your comment into the form of a question, that would be wonderful.
Oh, I don't need a microphone. Rebecca, thank you, panel. Thank you, AEI, for this wonderful moment. I love the title of this, A Sputnik Moment for Civic Education. There'd be some nice symmetry there. You really want me to use a mic? There'd be some nice symmetry there. And Robert and the rest of the panel started to get into this here a minute ago. The greatest problem we have, and by the way, I'm Ted McConnell. I direct the campaign for the Civic Mission of Schools, chaired by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor and Congressman Lee Hamilton, a group of organizations
hero of civic education.
dedicated to changing policies and practice so civic learning can flourish in every school in the country. Biggest problem we have, and Robert, you talked about it, is policies from the state to the district level, certainly policies from the federal level like No Child Left Behind that have narrowed the curriculum, that have taken civics and history out of state testing regimes. I think Circle has said, there are only 19 states that have any meaningful assessment in civics and history at this point. It might be lower than that. The problem we have is not ideology in K-12 civic learning. Rebecca, you talked about a study you all did here a few years ago called What High School Civics and History Teachers Know and What They Teach. They're completely in the mainstream of American thought. They believe in American exceptionalism. The problem we have is a lack of will on policymakers to create the time and the space. You're absolutely right, sir, about the declination of time in civic education. CEP did a study that during the NCOB era, the time devoted to civics and history, K-12, was reduced on average 37% in schools across this country. That's what we've got to reverse. And I'd be interested in hearing the panel's comments on how we can push policymakers to allow civic learning to flourish in schools across the country, I talked about the report that AEI did on what teachers know and teach. I urge you to read that. Also at civicmissionofschools.org, the Guardian of Democracy report, the Civic Mission of Schools report. But how can we get policymakers to do better?
Ted, can I ask you a question in return, which is what is your organization doing under ESSA to push state-level accountability, because now states have to have one non-testing a piece of their accountability regime? Is there a room for a civics component?
You bet there is, and we're working with policymakers in a number of states. I just got back from Sacramento, California, where we're working with Superintendent Torlickson's staff on how to inject civic and history content in to the revised test that they'll be doing there. But in every state in the country, Massachusetts has room now to inject content in. But what can we do, gentlemen and Rebecca, what can we do to push policymakers so that this can flourish?
I think support your organization. It sounds great what you're doing. No, but again, it is, there's part of it is just time on task. If you're teaching American history in government in 1 year, in New York it's 11th grade, I mean, you have 6 weeks to teach the pre-colonial era to through the election of 1800. I mean, so that's a lot of stuff, and you can't go deep. So Massachusetts, Alabama is the one state that does this now. It's a 2-year sequence. The pre-colonial era through 1877 Reconstruction is 1 year, and then 1877 till present is another year. And so, yeah, I think there are, I don't know how many states it is, but many states now, it is a 2-year sequence. So I think all states should be doing that.
If I, just as a sort of a tactical approach, just remember you have 2 missions. One, work for best practices. That is, Massachusetts has best practices, work to have other states adopt it. Then the other thing is try to push best practices forward another level. But I think if you're going to make the persuasive argument to state legislators, it's easier to say this has already been done elsewhere rather than we're blue skying it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would also just quickly add that whether you like it or not, testing is the straw that stirs the drink in our schools. I'd love to see us start to aggressively inject history, civics content into 3rd through 8th grade mandatory reading tests. Common Core really valorizes the founding documents over time. If teachers start to see, oh, hey, my kids, every year, here's the Federalist Papers, here's the Constitution, that message will seep through.
Right, that's the report that you mentioned. We found that civics teachers are maybe the only type of teachers who want assessment, because then it gives them some stake in the game.
Yeah, it gives them some oxygen.
So another question? Right here. Yeah, second row. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Tim Meisberger from the Asia Foundation. I had a question. You seem to have a focus throughout the entire discussion, which I really enjoyed, on institutions and on history, but you didn't really talk about civic values, about the idea of, do we teach children about political tolerance, for example, or support for free speech, and I think even going a little bit beyond values and say, what is the role of civic morality or morality in civic education? Thank you.
That's a great question. On the one hand, I think we get uncomfortable as teachers in imposing morality, even having these conversations. On the other hand, we valorize certain behaviors and attitudes all the time. You can't go through an elementary school and say please and thank you, hold the door. And older students, don't drink and drive, don't smoke. We send messages all the time. I'm personally quite comfortable with this, but I think it. To me, and I keep fetishizing this mission statement thing, it's about having a conversation about what is our purpose here, and just making it okay, pointing out that we do valorize certain attitudes and behaviors, and this is one that we all share. And by the way, if your orientation is more progressive, if you want to create the conditions that valorize diversity, this is the way to do it. You create the conditions that allow it to flourish, as opposed to going back to Karen Stenner's work, as opposed to being forward and aggressive about it and making people feel uncomfortable with it.
Any of the other panelists have thoughts? Probably lots of.
This is one of the areas where the activist teachers do use values as a way of importing political values. It is something which happens, I teach tolerance, therefore you must hate X group of people who are intolerant. It's something where once you've opened the door in your mission statements to teaching values, you open the door to a politicization of the values you teach. This is not perhaps impossible to solve, but it is, again, something I think you need practically to be aware of as you are formulating your mission statements and formulating your pedagogies.
I would say it's a double-edged sword. I remember being part of a roundtable discussion that actually AEI sponsored a few years back. And there was a teacher, I don't remember where she was from, Southwest, and she asked a question. She said something that she didn't think it was the role of the school to teach her students the concept of love of country. I believe that ought to be part of the role of the school. And in her statement, she says, what if we were Nazi Germany and we're teaching love of country? And my snippy response was, we're not Nazi Germany. But it's a double-edged sword, right? People have different opinions on some of these things. So.
I know there are many other questions, but in the spirit of civicness and being a good host, I do need to draw this to a close as I've overstayed all of your time, but please feel free to speak to the panelists afterwards. I'm sure they'll have a few moments to hang out. And thank you once again for joining us today for, I think, what was a very, very interesting and insightful, but also an immensely important discussion about civic education. So thank you. Thank you to the panelists.
Thank you.